Professor Abita, for this wonderful opportunity to talk about Shakespeare. Right, his birthday was on the 23rd, so we are obviously talking about him today. And I'm also happy to meet the undergraduate and postgraduate students of the Department of English, Bharati Women's College. So good evening to you all. I am truly happy to be a part of this program, primarily because we are going to speak about an author, right, who has had the capacity to abide, as Harold Bloom would call it. Shakespeare will abide. And during the course of this, discussion, we will speak about the different kinds of Shakespeare that we are familiar with, which obviously could not deal with during the last time. And as I was telling Professor Abita about, a very happy experience of writing a CV for William Shakespeare, with which I will begin and then talk about his works, focusing primarily on A Midsummer Night's Dream, Macbeth, and Tempest, the three plays that I could not deal with last time because we dealt with Twelfth Night, Antony and Cleopatra, and the other important plays that were prescribed for study. Now, when you take the birth of William Shakespeare in 1564 and his death on the 23rd of April, 1616. Now, he passed away when he was, or passed on, as we use that particular expression today, when he was 52 years old. And normally, we see that any human being attains to a state of maturity around that time. Right? When he or she arrives at that particular age, one is supposed to have what Keats would say, autumnal serenity and wisdom of age. So in that kind of things that you see, Eliot would say autumnal serenity and wisdom of age, or seasons of mists and mellow fruitfulness, as Keats would say. So in that particular context, let's say 52 years, and the day of his death, 23rd April, which is also the day of his birth, is a feast day of Saint George, who is the patron saint of England. Right? Like Carlyle would argue that Shakespeare was nature sent. Right? He is a hero as a poet. And he goes to the extent of saying in his expression of baudolatry that he would sacrifice anything for William Shakespeare, including the Indian Empire. The Indian Empire will anyway go, but we can never, ever give up our Shakespeare. So his name, obviously, as recorded, is William Shakespeare. And then the educational qualifications are not too impressive, one should say. He had a grammar school education at Stratford Grammar School. And he did learn, a bit of, classical literature in Latin and, Greek at that particular time. And he obviously did not go to the university, which made that infamous comment today made by Robert Greene, he is an upstart crow beautified with our feathers. Right? Robert Greene did comment on his lack of university education, but obviously was jealous that Shakespeare could succeed immediately. We mentioned this last time, that the first ever play that he wrote was Henry VI, a history play. And obviously from then onwards, he had been extremely successful in drawing crowds to his particular group. Between Blackfriars theatres and Globe Theatre was cheaper. Right? When Blackfriars charged 6 pence, they charged Globe charged only 1 pence. So many people thronged to Globe Theatre primarily because it was affordable. So at that particular time, let's say you see that this man also had a subject, we believe that he had a subject called debating. And it was an important part of the, grammar school education, which to me is an important detail, primarily because Shakespeare is the master of dialectical understanding of anything. It says, you should not have an irritable search after facts. Right? Today we say in post-colonial discourse, we say, or even Nietzsche made that statement, there are no truths, only interpretations. Right? What we call facticity is full of, what is called hyperreal at this particular time. Now, Shakespeare at that time had understood that there are always multiple points of view to any issue that you can possibly deal with. So no, university education. He married Anne Hathaway when he was 18. In a personal way, through the character of Hamlet, he obviously immortalized his son. Now he moved to London in 1592, leaving his family behind to pursue a career in theatre. And he initially was working as an actor, and slowly he decided that he can also write plays. And again, we have a belief that he obviously did not do all the major roles, while he was an actor. He was obviously on the periphery of the dramatis personae, and he was very close to the groundlings at that particular time. And it's believed, as one critic says, that he felt the pulse of the audience. Right? He felt the pulse of the audience, and he knew what they wanted and what should be given in order to make each of his plays successful. So 1592, he begins, his career in theatre. But what is most interesting is, that he is considered to be a family man, a good family man, because while he was in London, he always provided for his family, which was living in Stratford. And then in 1597, the family lived in a place called New Place, which was a very expensive, proposition at that particular time. And that obviously shows that Shakespeare had succeeded financially. And we said last time that during his time, he was only a popular writer. He was not the famous man whom we know today, the best dramatist in the world from England's point of view, one of the best dramatists, in the world, from a universal point of view. But he obviously began his career as a popular writer, catering for the needs of a wide variety of people, which will compose his scene in the context of the spectator area. From groundlings to the royalty, he had a supreme capacity to satisfy each one of those needs, or their needs. Groundlings, he knew what to give. The hangers-on, he knew what to give. The sailors who came into London and they were on their way out, what to give them. And it's believed that he uses a lot of nautical metaphors, primarily because many sailors came into London. They had a kind of a stopover in London, that they obviously watched his plays. And if you remember, we also made this statement, it is quite possible that a person who had seen the first play of Shakespeare could have lived to see the last play of William Shakespeare. Right? We believe that, 1588, is normally said, but 1592, he comes to London. Right? Between 1592 and 1612, he has been able to write 37 plays, 3 long poems, and 154 sonnets. Now, this is definitely a prolific output. Right? When you consider the kind of creativity that you associate with the other people, his contemporaries who thought that he would be forgotten. Right? And did he have a work experience? Yes, he did work as a school teacher in Stratford. Right? That's a very unique piece of information that we have about Shakespeare. Right? Today we consider him to be the greatest teachers, one of the greatest teachers of the world, or greatest teacher in the Western world. So he did begin as a school teacher in Stratford. And as I told you, from 1592 to 1612, he pursued his life in theatre. And he joined a troupe called Lord Chamberlain's Men, and then became a partner in that company in 1594. Right? Very interesting growth, you can say. Now we can understand why Robert Greene was extremely jealous. Right? He's an upstart crow. He's Johannes Factotum, a jack of all trades but master of none, primarily because of his financial success. Right? His professional success also. And as we said earlier, economically speaking, Globe Theatre was more affordable than Blackfriars. That many people came to watch the plays of William Shakespeare. And this Lord Chamberlain's Men, or the actors, the troupe, the owner, they became so rich that they could afford to build a theatre of their own in 1599, which we call the Globe Theatre. Right? See the growth, let's say. The exponential growth, let's say, of Shakespeare and his company. And we also talked about, when we discussed Richard II last time, we also talked about the importance of royal patronage, primarily because the playwright was caught between two stools, as it were, one the royalty, the other the Puritan corporation, which was also controlled by the royalty. Right? Which was also controlled by the royalty. Though we say that Queen Elizabeth was patron of arts, we also understand today through new historical readings that Queen Elizabeth needed theatre to sustain herself. Right? She had nowhere to go to. Theatre was the only thing through which she can reach to people. Obviously, in those days, you don't expect Queen to make public speeches. You don't expect queens, let's say, or queen or king, let's say, to directly have access to common people. In Henry IV, he makes that statement to Prince Hal, which I'll come to later. He says, I made myself scarce. Like Julius Caesar, he says, I made myself scarce so that when I come out, let's say, people throng to see me. But you seem to be so common, right, that you're always spending your time in tavern. Right? Your life in the tavern has made you absolutely accessible, and a king or a queen is not meant to be accessible. So Queen Elizabeth decided that theatre would be an efficacious means by which she can, today new historically will say, indoctrinate her people, or if you want to speak it positively, to inform people about what the royalty thinks, what the establishment thinks. Right? So he tasted immediate success with the writing of Henry VI plays, which also we accounted for last time. Spanish Armada, we mentioned that Spain had been defeated, and by defeating Spain, we said England had won a great battle. Materialistically speaking, the sea routes were open for England to, say, begin their colonizing process. And in the religious side, let's say, they obviously could keep Catholicism away from England. If Spain had won, it would have obviously imposed Catholicism on England. Right? In one sense, you can call it the victory of Protestantism. Right? So, at that time, we see that, say, between 1593, theatres were closed because of the plague. And he took recourse to narrative poetry like Venus and Adonis, the Rape of Lucrece, right? And both these poems dedicated to the Earl of Southampton. They lived in a time that without royal patronage, you just cannot survive. Right? You just cannot survive. So the Earl of Southampton, to whom he addressed sonnets 1 to 126. 127 and 1 to 152 are addressed to the Dark Lady, and the remaining two sonnets are expected to be translations or by Shakespeare, but having no connection with the two sequences that actually went before. Right? And predominantly sonnets 1 to 26 was verse letters, apparent verse letters written to the son of the Earl of Southampton, who was his patron, to get married. From fairest creatures we desire increase, the first sonnet. And sonnet number 116, he says, to say, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not time's fool. It carries to the edge of doom and things like that. So the first sequence is dedicated to the celebration of love, which he will take up in his comedies later. Right? The power of love to go beyond or to make you transcend the narrow bounds of your egoism. Right? The supreme power of love to make you go beyond, say, the confines of what we call our own petty self. Love as a great liberator. Right? Love as a great liberator. So in that particular context, the Earl of Southampton plays an important role in his life. And if you remember when we discussed Richard II last time, we said that the play was extremely popular during that time because people had become a bit cynical about Queen Elizabeth's reign. And we talked about it last time, that she knew that Richard II was Queen Elizabeth, and she executed Earl of Essex, but after having watched the play Richard II. Right, this we talked about last time. So this is the, say, creative output when you can talk about this particular experience. And then he started writing comedies. I told you last time that if you had seen that play movie Shakespeare in Love, after having watched Romeo and Juliet, the Queen says, why don't you write a comedy, Twelfth Night, as though she gives the title. Right? And we also spoke about the postmodern element in providing a play with an alternative title to suggest that nothing should be fixed. Right? Nothing should be fixed. So he wrote comedies both premature and mature. His premature comedies normally are described as, say, plays in the workshop. And his mature comedies, let's say, when he becomes an adept creative writer, when he has what is called a terrific comic vision. And that comic vision depends on what we call reconciliation with life. And that too, a happy reconciliation with life, not the let be of Hamlet. Right? Not the let be of Hamlet. Right? It's like we say in Tamil, idum kadandu pohum. Right? In that particular context, you see comedy celebrating life, comedy celebrating, say, the idea of reconciliation. And in particular, when I come to Tempest, I'll deal with it specifically, that there ought to be a cheerfulness under calamity. So let us say the bedrock of comedies is obviously reconciliation. And then let's say he wrote his tragedies, again, both premature and mature. And his mature comedies are obviously Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth. And Macbeth is the crowning glory of his tragic career. Right? His tragic career, which we will discuss today. And then, let's say we call his last plays dramatic romances. And in between, he wrote history plays, which again we talked about, say, very briefly last time. He wrote 10 English history plays. Henry VI, 3 parts, Richard III, called the first tetralogy. Richard II, Henry IV, part 1 and 2, and Henry V, second tetralogy, King John, and Henry VIII. Now, these are the 10 English history plays that he wrote. And he also took recourse to Roman history when he wrote Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, and Coriolanus. Right? And then, very interestingly, when he wrote Henry VIII, the famous history of the life of Henry VIII, right? The famous history of the life of Henry VIII, he was obviously celebrating the Queen's father, though the Queen was no more. Right? James I had already come to power. Right? 1612, he writes, obviously, along with John Fletcher. And the alternative title is All is True. Right? It's a very interesting title. Right? You write a history play. Right? You write a history play. And then you say, all is true. Right? Now, that very clearly indicates that he is not falsifying, number one. Right? That he is not falsifying truths. And number two, this could be a very ironic title. Right? Almost having what you call layers of subversiveness when he says, what I have presented is life of Henry VIII, the famous history of the history of the life of Henry VIII, and then you say all is true. I think you are needling the king. You are almost saying that I have indulged in something, you find out. And like we see in deconstruction, right? The text must contradict itself. Deconstruction is not a theory applied from outside, but deconstruction is a terrific method of reading. It's a reading strategy to see how the text is composed, let's say, contrary-wise. Right? So this is exactly what this title will indicate to us. All is true. Why would you say that? Right? Twelfth Night or what you will. Amazing title again. And like I told you last time, say in Twelfth Night, the festival of Twelfth Night or festivities associated with Twelfth Night are absent, as critics said. But yet, so you will say as or what you will. Title it whatever way you want to. Right? And the last play is supposed to be Two Noble Kinsmen. Right? Two Noble Kinsmen. Again, collaborated with John Fletcher. 1613 or 1614. And he dies in 1616. And we believe again through a legend that Ben Jonson and Michael Drayton visited William Shakespeare in Stratford. And he was so happy to see his former friends that they went on a drinking spree, and he died because of excessive drink. Right? And some critics say that even Harold Bloom subscribed to that view that he died of syphilis. So all that with regard to this particular, say, person's life. So this is the, say, career spanning between 1592 and say 1612. And he was buried on the 25th of April, 1616, in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon. And very interestingly, this is what was written, say, on his grave. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Right? Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. So very interestingly, this is what happens. Right? He is alive in a very different way. And nobody had ever touched those stones. Like Harold Bloom will say, Shakespeare is inimitable and unimitated. Right? Inimitable and unimitated. And much later, his friends Hemming and Condall in 1623 assembled his plays into a larger single format edition. Right? We know this edition as the first folio, then the quarto edition, and so on. Right? And what we see today at this particular time is that he abides in a very different way, which I will discuss both when I do Macbeth and Tempest. Right? Today, what we have is a multicultural Shakespeare. A Shakespeare who has been adapted in so many ways, from graphic novels to comic books to mere stories, which was begun by, say, Charles Lamb and Mary Lamb, right, to, let's say, amazing, say, take on his plays through movies. So he has obviously come to stay. Right, 20th century and 21st century. There is a lovely movie called Shakespeare Wala. It deals with, see, the English play, the troupe, say, comprising most of them, let's say, are English players, people from Britain, a few Indians acting there, and how India rejects the British Shakespeare, where their plays are not watched so much. They are desperate for theatres, right, after independence. Right? They perform in an open space of a king who has lost his power. They perform in schools, let's say, where they are not watched much. They perform in theaters where the play is disrupted primarily because Manjula, a film actress from Bollywood, comes into the theater, deliberately comes late to prove to her, say, person friend that she is obviously much sought after than these Shakespearean actors. And symbolically in that play, the chief actress of the troupe travels back to England in the ship as though he is moving away from India, but not true, primarily because he has come back with a different mask. He has come back, let's say, in a different form. Not only in India, but in other parts of the world, particularly in Asia, in China, in Japan, and in India, which I will briefly talk about later. Right? Now we will go back, let's say, to this man. Right? When Bloom was asked this particular question, why Shakespeare? He answered, who else is there? I don't think we need to agree with him at all. Right? I don't think we need to agree with him at all. Right? Why Shakespeare? Fine. Right? He's one of the greatest playwrights, because we should not obviously succumb to that temptation of saying that he is the playwright of the world without obviously coming across great playwrights all over the world, not just India. And I told you about that, say, it's a sentence in Renan Martin, Kalidasa is a Shakespeare of India. Many people protested against that statement. It was just a statement. It's only to prove a particular grammatical item. That particular sentence was added. Kalidasa is a Shakespeare of India. Right? And this obviously led to a kind of, say, academic discourse at that time. Right? At that time. Smarajit, there's one man who said that they have ruined Indian system primarily through the introduction of William Shakespeare and so on. But we agree with Harold Bloom when he said no one before him or since, particularly in the Western world, has made so many separate cells. Right? Dr. Chitra was mentioning that those 1,269 characters, major characters created by Shakespeare, which is a multitude. Alexandre Dumas made a statement, next to God, Shakespeare created the most. Right? Next to God, Shakespeare created the most. Now, these may sound like bardolatory. These may sound like hyperbolic praise of this particular writer, but when you go through his plays, go through his poems, go through his sonnets, which are, some of the sonnets are the most difficult poems in the English language, particularly sonnet number 129, which speaks about the power of lust, the expense of spirit and a waste of shame is lust in action. Right? And then after having a beautiful discourse on lust, he says, all this the world well knows, yet none knows well how to shun this heaven that leads men to hell. And in, say, the sonnet number 116, he says, this is love. This is love. Love is the understanding of true minds, let's say the marriage of true minds. Right? If this is not true, either human beings have not loved, or I will stop writing if it is, say, disproved. That kind of energy with which he writes his sonnets. Right? So one important point is, let's say, this bardolatory is there, but say BMW Tilliard, the names that Dr. Chitra mentioned, right? Tilliard, Dover Wilson, Wilson Knight, right? Gareth Lloyd Evans. These are amazingly great early 20th century, say, literary critics had put him on a pedestal, but not without a reason. Derek Traversy, amazing analysis of his plays. We just need to be alive, not only to the poetry in Shakespeare, but the drama in Shakespeare. Right? We normally are enamored of his lines. Lines are fine. Lines are fine. But beyond those lines, you see what is called amazing dramatic action. Right? Like my guru, Dr. Vishnubat, used to say, there is more poetry in Marlowe, there is more drama in Shakespeare. Right? It is the dramatic poetry that we need to, say, obviously deal with. Now, this bardolatory had almost created an impression that is a univocal colonial book. Right? That he is an Englishman. Right? He is an Englishman. that one of the burdens of the white man, as we call it in post-colonial discourse, white man's burden, right, is to educate Indians through Shakespeare. Right, to educate Indians through Shakespeare. Right, he is a roadmap to wisdom. Shakespeare was considered to be a roadmap to wisdom. And quite interestingly, William Miller, right, the founder of one of the greatest colleges, let's say, in this country, Madras Christian College, had said that he is the only way to understand life comprehensively. He gives us lessons in consciousness. We are going to see that later in the context of Macbeth. Right? He is the chart for life. That's what William Miller said. But today, he has become a political site, as Harish Triveji calls it. Shakespeare has become a political site. So we should not obviously contest his greatness, but to say that he is univocal, he is the best colonial book, we have problems. Right? Today, because he has become global and multicultural. There is a difference between universal Shakespeare and global Shakespeare. Universal Shakespeare is, let's say, you accept him as he is, as an Englishman, as his place as English plays. Whereas global Shakespeare will obviously adapt him. Right? Will obviously adapt him. Initially with a lot of trepidation, but later with enormous ease. That we adapted William Shakespeare. So in that particular context, we see that he obviously is today global and multicultural. I just talk about Throne of Blood and Rathanthiyam's Macbeth later, and Margaret Atwood's book on Tempest, based on Tempest, See in the Mirror of Auden, and so on. These are books, let's say, which we'll quickly refer to. Now, what did he ultimately focus on is inwardness. Right? It is his inwardness or exploration of the psychological and spiritual self that we go to William Shakespeare. Right? And today, we mentioned Harold Bloom again last time. Right? He has been replaced by arbitrary and ideological contextualization. Simply put, we are applying so many theories to Shakespeare that we have taken away his aesthetic power. Right? We have taken away his aesthetic potential. Right? We have taken away his aesthetic potential or his supreme capability of providing us with aesthetic delectation. And Bloom says very interestingly that today, even an aesthetic stance is an ideological position. Right? This is what my aesthetics is. Although it becomes a class position, a caste position, and so on. That is Bloom's argument, which he did not accept. So he called the French school the school of resentment. Now, what does he teach us before we go to Macbeth and Tempest and Midsummer Night's Dream? What does William Shakespeare teach us? He teaches us how to perceive the world. Right? Normally in the context of eco-critical discourse, we use this term, a crisis of perception. But today we should say that without Shakespeare, we will never be able to handle this crisis of perception with regard to our psychological, religious, and spiritual lives. So he obviously makes us perceive things properly, and he has also instructed us to experience, right? To experience rather than merely indulge in thought processes. Keats beautifully said, "Oh, for a life of sensations and not of thoughts." Right? And it was Keats who talked about Shakespeare's genius as a negative capability. Right? Multiple points of view, various ways of looking at things that you have. So in other words, you can say that Shakespeare's greatest contribution is like other playwrights. Right? I will not subscribe to that idea that he is the univocal colonial book. No. Because I am more interested in the global Shakespeare and the multicultural Shakespeare. But he definitely has enlarged us as consciousness. right? He has enlarged us as consciousness, and celebrating his universalism, Harold Bloom says that Shakespeare has enlarged our consciousness, and in that sense, he is post-national and post-gender. Right? He is post-national and post-gender. Right? And then what kind of universe did he create? We call it the Shakespearean universe. Right? What kind of universe does he create in that particular context? Just a minute. Right? It is a naturalistic universe. Right? Right? It is a naturalistic universe in which, let us say, the world of reality and the art world of non-reality have a beautiful interface. Now, when you say comedies, tragedies, histories, and romances, we spoke about them. Right? We will see that Shakespeare's plays can be understood as either a celebrant of life or it's pragmatically nihilistic. Right? We don't have faith in anything. Right? Say Arnold would say in Dover Beach, we are ignorant armies clashing by night. Right? You see that world weariness, that cynicism, that nihilism in the tragedies, and celebration of life in comedies and in romances. Right? So in that context, let's say we move to one of the great things that Shakespeare has done is that he moves away from the real world to the world of drama, and in its sweep, he carries the real world along with it, and he is obviously extending it in accordance with the requirements of his art. Right? So this is the quote that we have. One of the watermarks of Shakespeare's art is that he passes from the real world to the world of drama, which in its sweep carries the real world along with it, extending it in accordance with the requirements of his art. Now, Shakespeare never wrote prose. Apology for Poetry by Philip Sidney was written before Shakespeare. Right? He hadn't seen Shakespeare really, or he hadn't obviously come into contact with Shakespeare in plays because he would have been mentioned otherwise. Right? He was obviously the contemporary of the illustrious Marlowe, who is illustrious till today, but Robert Greene, Richard Peel, and obviously his greater, the author of Spanish tragedy, Thomas Kyd. So what does he do very interestingly is that he obviously must articulate his poetics. Right? When I talk about Macbeth, let's say we will again come back to Midsummer Night's Dream and Tempest and see how Shakespeare, from say the time that he wrote Midsummer Night's Dream, let's say in 1596 or so, till the time that he wrote his Tempest 1611, almost 18 years, he had expressed a sustained interest in poetics. Right? He obviously theorized. That made Northrop Frye make that very significant statement that most of his plays are both a process and a product. And today we call that metadrama. Right? One of the ways of describing, say, the plays of William Shakespeare, say from Calderwood, Shakespearean metadrama, we see that Shakespeare's major interest has always been how to compose plays and how to present it as plays. Right? The first part is how to write a play text. The second part is how to transform that into a performance text. Right? And that he does extremely well in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Right. Now, in this context, we will go to, say, the plots that Northrop Frye generally dealt with. Right? He talked about dramatic plots in general, which obviously can be applied to the plays of Shakespeare. Right? He talked about, say, dramatic plots, which we call comedy, satire, tragedy, and romance. Now, for Northrop Frye, comedy begins with an initial situation which is troublesome. Right? Viola landing in Illyria. Though the beautiful name Illyria, illusion. Right? Rosalind having a problem primarily because her father had been dethroned. Right? She's having problems living in the court. Orlando has a problem with Oliver. Right? You have this situation. Right? You have this situation. In Merchant of Venice, the play begins with then the indescribable, unexplainable kind of grief that Antonio suffers from. And then he loses everything, apparently loses everything, and then gets back everything and so on. So if the initial situation is problematic and the terminal situation is good, then we call that plot comedy. Only with regard to dramatic plots we are talking about. And this can obviously be applied to all the comedies of Shakespeare. Get all the comedies of Shakespeare. And when he wrote satires, not many actually, there have been satires within the frames of the play. Plots in which the initial and the terminal situation are both realistic and disappointing. You call it a satire. Right? You call it a satire. Right? In Midsummer Night's Dream, you know the problem. It's not a satire, but it's a satire on one of the meanings of the plays. It's a satire on love at first sight. Right? That love juice in itself becoming a huge metaphor for having a rollicking comedy with regard to what is called love. Right? That romanticized notion of love is mocked at in Midsummer Night's Dream, one of the early plays of William Shakespeare. Right? In other words, things in a satire stay bad. No improvement at all. But in a comedy, things improve. And then you come to plots where the initial situation is preferable to the terminal situation, and that you describe as tragedy. Right? That you describe as tragedy. In other words, things deteriorate. Right? Things deteriorate. So in that particular context, we move to the last one where the initial and the terminal situation are idealized and good. Then you have what is called a romance. In Winter's Tale, everything is good. Polixenes and Leontes have had an amazing friendship for a long period of time. Polixenes is so, say, favored in the court of Leontes, and things go bad. And finally, it is an idealized realization that friendship is strong and love obviously is unconditional. Right? So in one sense, you can say that keeping these dramatic plots into taking these dramatic plots into consideration, that you see that Shakespeare actually created three theatres. One, the theatre of comedy. Second, the theatre of tragedy. The third, the theatre of romance. Histories are obviously there, but these are the major, say, three theatres that we have. Now we'll go to Midsummer Night's Dream. Then I'll get back to this idea of metadrama towards the end. Right? It's a fantastical comedy, like I told you, gently satirizing what is called love at first sight. Right? 1596, that's the time that he begins. 1592, he arrives on the scene. Henry VI has already been written. Right? Now, what is the play about? And the play actually has 80% words and 20% prose. And today we know, let's say, that Midsummer Night's Dream is composed of classes, different classes, the royalty, the menials, and the supernatural people. Right? Oberon and Titania on one side, Theseus and Hippolyta on the other, then Demetrius, Lysander, Helena, Hermia on the other side. Then you have Bottom and Company, Peter Quince, Bottom and Company. So in one sense, let's say interestingly, James Calderwood says that in bringing in the supernatural and within the natural, let's say, two distinct class systems and marrying them, right? Marrying them, he argues, is Shakespeare's great taste of artistic success. Right? It's a great taste of artistic success. But why is it a Midsummer Night's Dream? One, it is very close to, say, festivities or the festive calendar of social rituals. Right? Of social rituals. particularly the fertility rituals, right, that happen, let's say, in what is called the traditional May Games. Story, simple story, not much really. Right, they are going to get married. Aegeus has asked, say, his daughter to get married to Demetrius, whom she doesn't like. She loves, say, Lysander. Helena loves Demetrius. Demetrius' former love was Helena. Now he is in love with Hermia. And Lysander and Hermia get into the woods. And this supernatural world of Oberon and Puck. And for me, say, Oberon and Puck almost, let's say, are figures who indicate that Shakespeare will once again bring them back onto his stage through Prospero and Ariel in the last play. Right? Oberon and Puck are nothing but Prospero and Ariel, because Puck is independent of Oberon, because he will play his own tricks, whereas Ariel is asked to control himself, not to do things that are not expected of him. And if you associate Ariel with creative imagination, then you can say Puck as imagination runs riot, and Ariel as imagination is within the confines of what is called a superior intellect, which will be able to, say, govern imagination. Govern imagination. And let's say the lovers obviously unite, and the love juice is poured both in Lysander's eyes and Demetria's eyes, and both of them fall in love with Helena. Right? Huge crisis. And obviously things will become all right. Say this woman will fall in love with an ass, whose bottom has bottom thou art translated. Amazing line for a theatrical transformation of an actor becoming a character. And this play is extremely important, like Peter Mudford says in a book called Making of Theatre. Right? Shakespeare, who had held a faithful mirror up to nature, holds a faithful mirror up to theatre itself. Right? In that particular sense, this is a play which deals with the process of theatre making. Right? People who have read the play, that Snout will have to announce that he is a wall. Snug will have to announce that he is a lion. Starveling will have to announce that he is a moon. Right? So Shakespeare takes on the power of dramatic illusion, but plays with it, toys with it. Because Coleridge made that amazing statement that you need to have a willing suspension of disbelief, which constitutes poetic faith. Not that Shakespeare did not know that when he wrote Midsummer Night's Dream, but he was toying with that idea of making theatre tangible and real. And Midsummer Night's Dream is obviously a great example of how various components of drama, various elements of drama are brought together, right, or brought together in one beautiful unity. That's why Calderwood said that it's a success of theatre itself. Right, now we will go to Macbeth, right, a very interesting play, right, again, written in 1606, 95% is verse, 5% alone is prose in that play, right, and quite interestingly, this play was written keeping King James I in mind, right, because the Scottish James claimed his ancestry from Banquo. And also, he himself was an author of, let's say, a book on witchcraft. Right? Obviously, you need a royal patron. And obviously, the play also refers to the trial of the gunpowder conspirators. And Macbeth is placed in between King Lear and Antony and Cleopatra. And like in any play that he does, Shakespeare has undertaken a radical compression and restructuring of the story that he has got from the Chronicles of England, Ireland, and Scotland from Raphael Holinshed, right? In which what he has done very interestingly is that Duncan is a good man, and Macbeth's reign actually was a peaceful reign according to history, but we don't get that impression at all in this particular play. And what does Macbeth deal with as a tragedy? Let's say, what does it deal with is very interesting, right? He is a soldier capable of extreme violence, right? cold brutality, but that can be tolerated if you are on the king's side. Never, let's say, when you are against the king, and that's precisely what happens. Now, what does Macbeth explore? Macbeth explores what is called the tragic consciousness of a character who constantly is, say, troubled with what is called guilt. Right? This is one of the important things that you have. Now, Macbeth obviously will take us back to Claudius, to Brutus, to Henry IV in King Richard II when he kills him and deposes him and kills him. Right? And what is most important is Shakespeare almost, let's say, provides you with this tragedy or tragic vision in Macbeth. Tragedy is often considered to be the genre in which the question of agency is most preeminent. Right? You are the agent of the action. Right? And Macbeth obviously becomes, as I told you, a person who goes through, right? A person who goes through enormous sense of guilt. Right? It's a shortest tragedy, the fastest moving tragedy, most economical, L.C. Knight says. Right? L.C. Knight makes a statement. Shortest tragedy, fastest moving, most economical of the tragedies, and in its use of language and thematic integration, the best tragedy ever. And what you have in the play is the pronounced atmosphere of evil. And since morality plays were still written and watched during Shakespeare's time, it's considered to be one of the greatest morality plays, and it is considered to be the most instructive tragedy. Now, what has happened, let's say, is when Macbeth murders Duncan, he has irrevocably corrupted the sacred part or sacramental part of his innermost self. We said that Shakespeare's primary concern is the self. Right? His primary concern is the self. And by killing Duncan, Macbeth murders sleep. We'll see that later. Not only does he say murder sleep, he murders what is called, in Indian terms, let's say it is called, he has murdered Aram or he has murdered Dharma. And while doing so, he has killed what is called the sacramental part of his self. And then his intense self-consciousness makes you get into his conscience, as it were. Like we said, that Shakespeare's greatest thing is to offer us with perceptions. Macbeth provides us with a perceptual system. Right? He's provided us with a perceptual system. And more importantly, he is very much concerned with time. Right? He has a particular obsession with, say, overcoming time. Shakespeare has said, let's say in Sonnet 116, I told you, love is not time's fool, he says. In another play, he says, we are time's fools. Right? We are the fools of time. Right? We are the fools of time. And very interestingly, he attempts to murder time. He's attempting to murder the future itself by killing Fleance. Then we speak about the importance of this word imagination. In Renaissance debate, let's say in Renaissance debate, or in Renaissance discourse, the word imagination and fantasy were interchangeably used. The context will tell you whether it is imagination or fantasy. If it is imagination, let us say, it obviously is, say, a personal replacement with divine inspiration. In Henry V, he has said that, oh, for a muse of fire. Right? Milton says that. He says, you go above the Ionian Mount. Right? You seek inspiration. It has been from, say, the Greek days, Greek times. So either it can refer to the poetic energy which comes into you when you are inspired, right? Where divine inspiration completely transforms you, or it can also mean a loss of reality or a loss in reality. Right? We said that. Richard II பண்ணும்போது இது சொன்னோம். Right? Richard II சொல்லும்போது இது பண்ணினோம். That the major problem with Richard II, particularly his poetry, is that he cannot relate to reality. Right? He cannot relate to reality. So Macbeth suffers from a loss in reality when the Birnam Wood, let's say, walks towards or moves towards his obviously palace, his castle. Right, Dulcinea, then that's the impression that you get. Right? And like we said earlier, when you suffer from a loss in reality, you obviously displace your sacred and replace it with the secular. And Bloom describes Macbeth as a visionary tragedy. Right? He is obviously a murderer, a butcher. Right? He's a murderer, a butcher. This death butcher, that's how Malcolm calls him. Right? So that is the most important thing. But though he is a brutal murderer, he is also deeply imaginative in this particular sense. Right? In this particular sense. And then, let us say, we see again the whole futility of everything. Right? When you ask that important question, what did Lady Macbeth and Macbeth achieve in the end? Right? What did Lady Macbeth and Macbeth achieve in the end? Nothing, really. Can you imagine, let's say, an evening with King Macbeth and Queen Macbeth and all the Thanes there? Right? All the Thanes there, constantly fear-stricken. Who will be the next one to be killed by Macbeth? There is no peace, either in themselves or in others, because of Macbeth getting the crown from Duncan, forcibly. So in that particular sense, Macbeth's horror of time is in keeping with his own deep desire to free himself from time. Like Keats would like to fly with the nightingale, because thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. He would like to fly away from time. And that famous soliloquy, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, provides us with that understanding. He is so obsessed with time, and he is invariably interested in the language of theatre. It's a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Is a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. Both are in keeping with the language of theatre and the language with regard to time. Now, this is related to what is called a Gnostic cosmos, Gnoistic, agnosticism, we use that particular term, which is obviously a kind of, not a very happy, system. It was a subversive system which believed in one's own morality. You don't believe in orthodox morality. And most interestingly, this Gnosticism leads to, right? This Gnosticism leads to an utter lack of belief in everything. Hope, faith, right? Honor, right? Hope, faith, honor, everything. Let's say you lose faith in everything in that particular context. And like Hamlet, after Hamlet, let's say one should say, because Macbeth is the last of the great tragedies, you see that he has constantly been using the language of theatre. Right? And then he is associated with what is called a word kenoma, K-E, let's say N-O-M-A, which actually means cosmological emptiness. Right? K-E-N-O-M-A. Right? Cosmological emptiness. Macbeth ultimately realizes that futility of everything, signifying nothing. Right? Very interesting. Tale told by an idiot, you need a story. Right? You need a story. And then you need to transform that into a play. And Macbeth's play, or the play world, which is his kingdom, in itself is a bit of a problem. Right? It's a bit of a problem. Right? That's a situation that you see in Macbeth. And then, let's say, going back with regard to what we talked about earlier, right? Macbeth's obsession with time is an actor's obsession, not a poet-playwright's obsession. Right? In Tempest, you see, between 2 and 6, we'll have to do now. You have to finish this play, say, Prospero tells Ariel. A 4-hour tale where the performance time cannot go beyond 4 hours. Whereas in Macbeth, let's say, the pressure on him is an actor's problem. His consciousness is that of an actor's and a director's, and not a poet-playwright's. And then, you know, if you are a poor player who struts and frets your hour upon the stage, then you destroy that illusion. And that's what his kingdom is actually. Right? Using his own imagination, his own inwardness. External agents are there. The witches are there. Lady Macbeth is there. But unless you have a proclivity for killing, proclivity for destroying, right, you will never be able to do all that in spite of his hesitancy in the beginning. So Macbeth is a Jacobean hero villain because other playwrights were creating such images, let's say. And none of the main characters in the play have a personality at all, except Macbeth, except Macduff. Not Malcolm, not Donalbain, not Duncan, not Ross, not Lennox. Nobody in the play in that particular context. Then it is believed that actually the play Macbeth deals with the biblical dualism which was created by Jeremiah the prophet. One is called the injustice of outwardness. The other is called the potential morality of your own inwardness. And quite interestingly, in one of the Indian philosophical systems, we use the term pravritti marga and nivritti marga. One is called the outward path, where the mind constantly, ceaselessly attaches itself to the external world. The other is called the nivritti marga, which is also called the path of return. Macbeth is caught between these two, or rather, he has lost himself in the outward path. Right? He has lost himself in the injustice of outwardness. So when he obviously kills sleep, he murders sleep in that particular context, he comes to that Gnostic view that everything should be destroyed. I begin to be weary of the sun, he says, where the sun is associated with time. And I wish the estate of the world were now undone. Right? You see that Hamletian streak? That he wishes that the world would thaw and melt into a dew. Right? He wants the world to just disappear like a dew. Same desire you have here. I begin to be weary of the sun. Wish the estate in the world were now undone. Right? In other words, Macbeth realizes that, right? Macbeth realizes that what he experiences is a terrible emptiness. And that emptiness is not personal. That emptiness is a terrific world weariness. Right? Tamil virakti endra vaartha solluvom. Tan personal virakti. It's not personal experience alone. It goes beyond that. And when you look at mysticism normally becomes, if mysticism cannot succeed, if mysticism fails, it becomes apocalypse. Apocalypse na idalam pannina idalam thavirka mudiyadu. A warning that comes from people. Apocalyptic literature tells you that if you continue in this way, you are going to get destroyed. So Macbeth can never be a mystic, but Macbeth at the same time can never be a part of apocalyptic vision. That leads to, say, what is called Gnosticism. Right? Because Gnosticism has no hope at all in this life or after. Right? And then when you say that Macbeth has murdered Duncan or he has murdered sleep, actually Macbeth has murdered all hope and all meaning of existence. Right? He has lost all meaning of existence. So this is the situation that you have in this particular context. And Shakespeare has always alluded to this idea of sleep, dream, in Midsummer Night's Dream, for example. Methought I heard a voice cry, sleep no more. Macbeth does murder sleep. And what is sleep? He brilliantly describes, sleep is innocent. Sleep knits up the raveled sleeve of care. And beautiful, sleep is the depth of each day's life. And even more important, it is a balm of hurt minds. So Macbeth, by murdering Duncan, has murdered sleep, and by murdering sleep, what he has done is he has murdered mysticism, he has murdered apocalypticism, and he has obviously embraced Gnosticism, thereby losing faith in everything, right? Losing faith in every single thing. Now we'll quickly talk about Tempest, right? One of the very interesting plays when you can talk about the last play of William Shakespeare, right? The last play of William Shakespeare, right? Again, 1611, right? Around 2,341 lines, 80% words, and prose is 20%. Even Caliban speaks words, right? Caliban today in post-colonial discourse is not considered to be a villain, or is not considered to be a person who should not be, brought within the confines of a rational, intellectual, moral, spiritual world. Today, he is the one who questions it. Right? Amy Casier wrote a play keeping Caliban as a black man, questioning white patriarchy. Right? So obviously, it depended on, the contemporary stories of travel and exploration, Montaigne's major essay of the cannibals, Ovid's Metamorphoses, particularly with reference to Prospero giving up his rough magic or his magical powers, right? And it has a restricted cast, right? It has deliberately confined the setting, which is the island. And it obviously has, as one critic would say, claustrophobic timeline that's between 6 and now. This is 2 and 6, actually. He experiments with following the unities of time, place, and action, which had already attempted in Comedy of Errors. And the central theme, he repeats it. We have seen that in As You Like It. Right? Younger brother throwing the older brother out. Older brother going into the forest of Arden. Prospero goes into, let's say, what is called this magical island, or island transformed into a magical island. Yeah, that's the play. Thank you, Abhita. So in that particular context, so you see this situation that the play deals with power, authority, usurpation. And today, in post-colonial, situation, we do see this as a parable of colonial expansion. Right? Particularly when they reached out to, say, Americas. Caliban obviously becomes the supreme power that we associate, people with today. So in other words, Caliban is the empire writing back. Right? In that play, as I told you, as Abhita wrote, gave the title to you, 1969, that play was written. Right? Caliban is a black revolutionary who wishes to strip himself of the oppressor's language. You know, Casier and, Franz Fanon, right? What is called the movement negritude. They used Caliban as a great spokesman to do that. Right? You taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. Now, that is the idea that we see that. And then, obviously, we see that Antonio as a power of evil present in that world, right? Present in that particular world, right? He keeps quiet, like Iago in Othello. Prospero forgives him. There is not even a word of thanks from Antonio. After he had made an attempt to kill Prospero through, let's say, an unseaworthy travel, earlier with a boat that was leaky, but for those books that Gonzalo had put in, he remains quiet, let's say, throughout the play. And he is the one who is actually, cajoling Sebastian to kill his brother Alonso. Right? There's a beautiful line in the play. He says, I am standing water. He says, I will teach you how to flow. Right? I am standing water. I will teach you how to flow. And quite interestingly, throughout the play, Prospero's magic is seen as, or it is demonstrated via theatre. Right? It is demonstrated via theatre. So it obviously becomes a terrific allegory of theatre making. Themes are there, stories obviously is there. Right? That amazing love relationship between Miranda, because women characters dominate the last place. Right? The women characters dominate the last place. So in that particular context, we see that Tempest is a terrific play which actually deals with theatre apart from the huge political themes of colonization. Right? Hackseed by Atwood obviously deals with this principle. Right? Many versions of Tempest, let's say, have women as Prospero. Right? Women as Prospero. Prospero today is a colonial bully. Not that providential figure of care, concern, right? That white man's burden, as we call it, with regard to Caliban. No, not today. Right? Now, in that context, let's say we will speak about Shakespeare's, interest in the language of theatre. Right? Already we have mentioned the statement made by, or the soliloquy of Macbeth. And after having said she should have died year after, right? He understands that life is nothing but the control of time over human beings. We are nothing but an end product of what is called the ravages of time. Right? It creeps in this petty pace to the last syllable of recorded time. Out, out, brief candle, he says. And then that famous metaphor. Life is a tale told by an idiot. Right? It's the actor in the play is a poor player. Right? And ultimately that nihilism that we talked about. Now, I told you in the beginning itself that from A Midsummer Night's Dream through As You Like It, Hamlet, to Tempest, you have a beautiful way in which Shakespeare has articulated his aesthetics. Right? In Midsummer Night's Dream, we have already talked about the power of theatre or the powerlessness of theatre when Bottom and company perform what is called Pyramus and Thisbe. And Thisbe just becomes a flute. Right? Now, Theseus is the first aesthetician of William Shakespeare in A Midsummer Night's Dream. He is the first one to consciously speak about art. Right? You know the famous lines. A poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling. Right? When you come to the fifth act of the play, he makes that statement. Right? And what he does, he glances from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. Right? That's a beautiful metaphor. Shakespeare was responding to a word called enosis, which means poetic heaven. Right? Poetic heaven. Enosis. Right? In Sanskrit aesthetics, we call it alaukika, the art world. Right? We use the word alaukika to indicate the art world. Enosis actually is that poetic heaven. So he obviously says that a poet's eye constantly links heaven with earth, like Robert Frost does in the poem called Birches, where the birch tree is connected to the earth. He goes toward heaven, that's the expression that he uses, and he will make the tip of the birch tree touch the ground, thereby bringing up a beautiful interface between the poetic heaven and the real world. Right? Poetic heaven and the real world. And in Hamlet, he obviously speaks about how one should act, suit action to the word, word to action. And then he has said, which is theory today, that both at first and now was and is to hold, as it were, a mirror up to nature. Right? A mirror up to nature. Now, when you come to Winter's Tale, very interestingly, you have Time the chorus speaking in the fourth act of the play. Right? And a critic has done us great service by saying that when you count the number of lines in Winter's Tale, in the 5 acts of the play, right? It has been, pointed out that the first 3 acts, the lines in first 3 acts and the lines in last 2 acts, let's say, actually are one and the same. They match, amazingly match, which actually provides you with what is called this beautiful romance vision of William Shakespeare. And Time the chorus does that very well. Shakespeare says, I can write comedies. If you want, I will obviously write tragedies. And if you are really vexed with my tragedies, I will give you romance. I am in control. Right? I am in control. So, adapting the title from, say, Stephen Hawkins, right? I would say that Shakespeare himself is a brief history of time. And he is a brief history of time. And he says, time speaks as chorus. Let us believe that Shakespeare speaks. I that please some try all, both joy and terror of good and bad, and makes and unfolds error. And then he tells that I am going to tell you what has happened in these 16 years or 15 years. But what is most important to me in that particular passage is that I can change law, I can overwhelm custom. Right? I can change law, I can overcome, he says, I will obviously change everything now. And if you have, in the context of the play, 3 acts you have suffered intensely, I promise you that you will not suffer anymore. I am going to provide you with a tragic comic vision in the remaining part. So he says, since it is in my power to overthrow law and custom, right? Since it is in my power, Shakespeare says, I will create my universe. I will create my own theatre. And in that world, I will overwhelm custom. I can transform anything. That I will not believe in categories. You don't fix me with categories. Right? I will write tragicomedies. I will move from tragedies to romance at will. Now that is the power that you see. He says, to overthrow law and in one self-born hour to plant and overwhelm custom. I am the creative power. Right? I am the creative God, as it were. That's why Alexandria Dumas said, say, next to God, Shakespeare has created the most. Then when you come to, say, Tempest, quite interestingly, the last play of William Shakespeare, that is written alone. Collaborations followed later. 2 Noble Kinsmen, and then first Henry VIII, and then 2 Noble Kinsmen followed later. 13, 14, 16 is no more. But in Tempest, let's say, what we see very interestingly is the whole gamut of Shakespearean plays are presented to us. And it is quite possible to see 3 epilogues in Tempest. Normally, ella playlium, say, oru epilogue dhaan irukum. Epilogue is the last person who speaks. Right? And you see, obviously, Puck speaking. Right? You see Puck speaking, saying that, imagine that you have dreamed here. Imagine that you have slept here, and so on in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Have we shadows offended? So when you come to Tempest, story part we have talked about, it deals with power, it deals with authority, it deals with moral corruption, right? It deals with moral corruption. And what is even more interesting is it obviously deals with the pitfalls of colonization. So now we will quickly talk about our revels are now ended, that famous passage, which I would consider to be the first epilogue in the play. Right? That's the first epilogue in the play. Our revels are now ended. You know, he suddenly stops the mask from being performed because he remembers Caliban has plotted against him in the play. Now, this can be considered, let's say, as an epilogue to the entire play's complete works of William Shakespeare. Right? These, our actors, as I foretold you, where all spirits are unmelted into air. Right? They have obviously responded to imaginary stimuli. They have ushered in an imaginary world. Right? They've ushered in an imaginary world. They are gone now. We have put on the boards called the stage, right? A life which is not artificial, right? It is not unreal, but non-real. They are just gone. They have melted into thin air. Like the baseless fabric of this vision. And all that I have created in the play, the cloud-capped towers, gorgeous palaces, solemn temples, and the great globe itself. Even that will come down. And his prediction came true in 1612 when Globe Theatre burned down when Henry VIII was first performed. Right? Or Kavinjanoda Varthika or power irukku solluvaanga generally. India, we believe in that. Right? That is the most important point. He had just said that. Even this globe will obviously destroy itself. It will come to say nothing. Everything will dissolve and will not leave a rack behind. Right? And that is very interesting. We are such stuff as dreams are made on. Midsummer Night's Dream began with that principle of creating a fantastic world. Imagine that you have slumbered here, say Puck in the epilogue. All of them are victims of dreams. Everybody is in a dream, a grand dream. Whether it is the menials, whether it is the supernaturals or the elite in the play. And ultimately, he says, our little life is rounded off with a sleep. Right? Our little life is rounded off with a sleep. And in Act 4, Scene 1, you have a famous speech called, "You elves of hills, standing lakes and groves." Now, this would be a second epilogue, which would be, again, an epilogue to his comedies and tragedies. Right? Comedies and tragedies and his romances. Right? Very briefly, I will tell you. Ye elves of hills, referring to A Midsummer Night's Dream. Standing lakes and grooves, let's say, and ye on that sands with printless foot do chase the ebbing Neptune, all referring to the world of As You Like It. And then when you come to that place, I have bedimmed the noontide, let's say, sun, called forth mutinous winds. Yes, he is actually bringing in the world of tragedy. Right? One can say that the whole gamut of Shakespearean tragic world is just brought within the confines of these lines. I have bedimmed the noontide sun, called forth mutinous winds, betwixt the green sea and azured wall, set roaring war. You see that in King Lear, you see that in Macbeth, you see images of that in, say, in Othello and in Hamlet. And then he says, but this rough magic I here abjure. I'm giving up this tragic world. Right? Now you require some heavenly music, which ushers in the world of romance, to work mine and end upon their senses. This airy charm is for. And comes that amazing line, I will break my staff, buried certain fathoms in the earth, and deeper than did ever plummet sound, I will drown my book. And it is quite possible to see that this book refers to the aesthetics of William Shakespeare. Now, when you go to Dr. Faustus, there is a reference, I will burn these books. Shakespeare says, through Prospero, I will drown my book. Right? I will drown my book, very clearly to indicate that Shakespearean poetics can always be revived. Right? Can always be revived. Right? But revived in so many different ways. Right? We said that from universal Shakespeare to global and multicultural Shakespeare. And the last epilogue, spoken by Prospero, which is the final one, is obviously a bidding of farewell to theatre itself. I have forgiven everybody. Right? I did have problems with Robert Greene. I called him a green-eyed monster in say, that play. Othello, beware my lord, jealousy is but a green-eyed monster. Maybe I had Robert Greene in mind. I have forgiven all those people who had worked against me, as I should be forgiven by those people who think that I have hurt them. And my project, which was to please. Right? The project that was to please. Now, all that he wants is to release Prospero Shakespeare, from the confines of the stage so that he can retire to the new place that he built in 1599, right? And then, very interestingly, he speaks about the power of mercy, right? Unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all its faults, right? One of the greatest virtues that Tempest speaks of is what is called this compassion for humanity. Right? The rarer action is in virtue than in vengeance. Right? The rarer action is in virtue than in vengeance. After all, it's also a revenge play in a very different way. So in that particular context, Shakespeare provides us with this interesting thing. Now, finally, we will speak about, say, multicultural Shakespeare in about 5 minutes. I'll wind up. What he has done, this Shakespeare, who is called multicultural and global, he has crossed multiple cultural borders, and he is now appearing in diverse contexts. Right? He's appearing in diverse contexts, and I will obviously say, quote what Rathantiam said about Macbeth. Right? He said that why Macbeth, when that question was asked, he said, Macbeth is a disease. Right? Macbeth is a disease. And I believe that disease of greed will continue. Right? The disease of greed will continue. Macbeth is a disease. And in that play, luckily, I had the opportunity to see the play. You have multiple Macbeths completely bandaged with so many nurses, let's say, pushing him, let's say, in a wheelchair in the play. Right? All that is very important in that particular sense. You can translate Shakespeare, you can adapt Shakespeare, right? You can argue for a political reading of his plays. Right? You have Makbul dealing with Macbeth. Right? You have Jairaj, let's say, from Kerala, doing amazing things with William Shakespeare. One, he wrote Kaliyattam, which is Othello. Right? He wrote Kannagi, which is a terrific, say, response to Antony and Cleopatra. Right? And the last play, which obviously did not do well, Veeram, right? Veeram, which is based on Macbeth. Everybody seems to respond to that. Right? Everybody seems to respond to that primarily because, like we use the term let's say that there are certain emotions, in spite of all the political readings that we indulge in, there are certain emotions that will be universal in that particular context, right? That will obviously be universal in that particular context. So when you say that, then, right, when you say that, then, whether it is Ratantiyam or Makbul or say, let's say Veeram, right, is Macbeth, people have done so many tempests, right? India particularly is responding to William Shakespeare in so many different ways. You have the Amara Shakespeare, let's say, taking on Shakespeare humorously, right? Hamlet the Clown Prince, let's say, that play, say, directed by Rajat Kapoor. Terrific instances, right? Terrific instances where you can take on this man, you can adapt that man, and obviously Shakespeare, among all the writers of the world, that I can say confidently, among all the writers of the world, has a terrific adaptive resilience. And once again, going back to, say, Harold Bloom, Shakespeare will abide not as the Anglophone William Shakespeare, but the multicultural and global Shakespeare. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, Abhita, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for that wonderful lecture.
Yep. Pleasure,
And
pleasure, Dr. Chitra.
we enjoyed every minute of it, and it was really wonderful, sir. I don't find any words to express how you dealt with those three plays, actually, Midsummer Night's Dream, Tempest. It gave a world of new thoughts, actually, to look at these plays in a very, very different manner, both from the post-colonial perspective and also, as you say, from the multicultural perspective that you were mentioning. And it was a wonderful lecture, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. And all the very best for all the students and say teacher friends. And thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity of attempting to understand the Bard upon Avon. Right, there's so much to him and so much to his place. Like there is so much, let's say, to speak about all great writers like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Kalidasa, Basa, Bharadiyar, all great writers of the world. Let's say each one, let's say, is a unique gem, which obviously can be explored in multidimensional ways. And today we had an opportunity to deal with one of those gems called William Shakespeare. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Abhi, thank you, Lord. Abhi, are you able to hear me, Abhi?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. If you want any questions to be asked or something?
Yes, I thought probably we can give students a few minutes if they have any questions.
Please. Yeah. Thank you.
If you have any questions, you can either share it in the chat or you can unmute yourself and interact with sir. I could see postgraduates attending the session. Queries or responses.
Yeah.
I'll check the chat.
Yeah. Any questions?
Lots of thank you messages from
Okay.
Dr. Srilata, from Prema ma'am, from Radha
Yeah.
ma'am.
Okay.
There are no specific questions.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Okay.
sir. The sheer sweep of it was amazing.
Thank you.
It was like a journey. Thanks a lot. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you. All the very best, and God bless you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much. Thanks a
Thank
lot,
you.
sir.
Thank you, Abhi. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye,
Thank
Abhi.
you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you,
so
Dr.
much.
Chitra. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, shall we end the meeting?
Yes, yes, Abhi, we can end
Yes,
the
ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you all. Thank you
yeah.
all. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, pa.